Hello and welcome again to one of our landlord update videos. For those who don't know, my name is Matt Dilks. I'm a director at Christopher Shaw Lettings. I'm joined by James Tiller, a fellow director of the business. Hello, James.
Hi.
So today we've chosen to speak about EPCs and some recent changes which have occurred as part of the Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards legislation. We welcome Craig Bowling, an energy assessor from VeriSmart, to talk about the subject and give some insight into what you need to know before letting your properties. Craig, hello. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good. Yeah, you're very welcome. Very welcome. So we'll get straight into it today. We wanted to start off. Please, could you tell us a bit about what you do and a bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, my name is Craig Bowling. I'm a director for VeriSmart Bournemouth and Southampton. We offer a full range of property inspections and compliance solutions to agents and landlords, predominantly in the lettings industry. I'm also a qualified domestic energy assessor, which allows me to undertake EPCs on domestic properties marketed for rent or sale.
Fantastic. So very simply to start off then, Craig, just to break it down, what actually is an EPC for those who may not know?
So an EPC is an energy performance certificate. This was introduced by the government in 2007, and it's effectively a property survey to ascertain the energy efficiency of a property being marketed for rent or sale. Now, the survey primarily covers an evaluation of the property's construction type, roof type, insulation, heating, lighting and glazing. They're the main areas that we have to look at when carrying out an EPC. These surveys are non-invasive and evidence-based. They have to be carried out in person as opposed to a full SAT EPC, which is what they do for new build properties, because they are calculated using building schematics and plans. An EPC, when passed, it lasts 10 years, although it's worth knowing that if a major change happens within the property, such as changing electric heating to gas or putting in a loft conversion, then a new EPC should be carried out upon completion. But that's basically what an EPC is.
Fantastic. So you just touched on 2 points there. Can you clarify what you mean by a non-invasive and evidence-based?
Certainly. So non-invasive means we don't intrude on the tenant or homeowner's possessions when we're in the property. So for example, if the water tank was in an airing cupboard and this was full of bedding and clothing, we do not pull all that out to evaluate the water tank. If they're present and happy to do it, then that's fine. But we have to keep our distance, if you like, and show a bit of respect to what's inside a property. This could also be things like moving appliances, if the furniture is stacked in front of a boiler, or the loft being so full that we can't get into it. In these situations, we have to make some assumptions for the survey. Likewise, we wouldn't lift floorboards or put holes in walls and ceilings to see what's inside. By evidence-based, in order to include something on an EPC, especially if we take in insulation, for example, we have to be able to view it, photograph it and measure it in order to include it. So a common example where we have problems is cavity wall insulation. So a lot of houses in the Bournemouth area, especially around the 80s and 90s when there were a lot of grants for low cost cavity wall insulation, they took them up on this. And for us to be able to include cavity wall insulation, we need some evidence that it's there. So if you're walking around the exterior walls of a property and you can see the drill holes where they used to pump the insulation in, that's fine. We can use that as evidence. However, if the walls have been rendered or if the insulation was put in using a different method, which sometimes meant they could go into the loft and pour it down the cavity, then there's no evidence that we can visibly see. Like I mentioned earlier, we wouldn't put a hole in the wall to find out if it's in there. So in this instance, if the homeowner has got the installation certificate, then we can use that. That's absolutely fine. However, if there's no certificate and there's no evidence, we can't install it, even if the homeowner or landlord is absolutely certain they've got it. And this is one of the grey areas because, you know, it could cause as much as a 5 or 10 point difference on an EPC. But that's what we mean by those 2 points.
Okay, brilliant.
So there have been some changes to EPC legislation over the past couple of years. How have the regulations progressed and where are we now with them?
So the main point in the last couple of years, well, sorry, the first point in the last couple of years that really stands out was April 1st, 2018. So the government announced that for any domestic properties being wanted to be marketed for new lets, they were required to have an EPC with a minimum energy rating of E, or 39 points. Properties failing to reach this mark couldn't be marketed until the improvements had been made to upgrade the efficiency. So to summarize that, if you had a tenancy that started on or after April 1st, 2018, if you haven't already taken action, you are required to immediately take action to upgrade the efficiency to a E rating or register an exemption. You should have already have done that. For existing lets, it was slightly different, although April the 1st this year is still the main date to bear in mind. If you had a tenancy that started before April 2018, but it runs until at least the 1st of April of this year, then you had until the 1st of April this year to make the improvements. So you had a bit of time, but you had to make the improvements by the 1st of this month or register for an exemption if you wanted to continue to let it. If you had a tenancy that started before April 1st, 2018, but you want to enter into a new tenancy agreement, and that could be with a new or existing tenant, then you need to have those improvements in place first, and you cannot enter into a new tenancy with a existing or new tenant until the energy rating is up to an E or an exemption has been made and accepted by the exemptions register. So that's where we were in terms of the legislation. What the government has done, they brought in a variety of grants and government-backed help to help property owners achieve the required ratings. So we saw things like green deals, the cavity wall installation grants that we touched on earlier, local council grants. These things were brought in to try and help people achieve these ratings. Now, the cost cap for any of this work undertaken was set at £3,500, which includes VAT. So as a landlord, if you have to do work on your property to get the rating up and you're not entitled to an exemption, then you will never be asked to pay more than £3,500, including VAT. So that gave the landlord some options. They can go down one of the grant processes. If they receive funding of up to £3,500 and that covers all the work, then that's great, that's what they can do. If they could receive, let's say the work they needed to have done was £2,000 worth of work, but they could only get £1,000 worth of funding, then they are required to top up that additional £1,000 in order to get the work done. And worst case scenario from a landlord's perspective, if they're not eligible for any third-party funding or a grant, and they still have to make the improvements, then they have to fund that themselves. Again, the cap would still be £3,500. They couldn't pay any more than that. If the work required came to more than £3,500, then landlords are required to get as much work done possible up into the £3,500 limit, and then file for an exemption to say that they've done all the work, but it still doesn't meet the current requirements. So that's where we are in terms of the legislation at the moment and the options that are available to landlords.
Obviously, there was that big change, or the development, as you mentioned, that occurred on the 1st of April this year. Now, there were plenty of articles about it prior to the coronavirus lockdown, the outbreak, and that kind of stuff. But has it sort of been forgotten about because of that? Or, you know, because the legislation isn't new, is it? So has it been forgotten about, or what are the government doing, or what are they saying about these kind of things at the moment?
Where we stand is, like you say, the legislation isn't new. It was announced well in advance of the start date, which was the 1st of April 2020. The legislation has just been introduced in increments. So the first is gone, therefore it's now a legal requirement. The world's at a standstill at the moment, and you know, our day-to-day life is on hold, and I imagine the people that would be policing this sort of stuff are probably off work and sat at home at the moment. We would advise all our agents and landlords the same thing. You know, the risk lies with you as to whether you adhere to legislation at the right times. Just because it's more unlikely that someone will pick up on it doesn't mean it's impossible. So as a supplier, we make sure our clients have got the right information to make the right decision at the right time, and we can only hope that they do that. So the legislation hasn't been forgotten about. It's just like everything, the world's on hold at the moment, so it's kind of going under the radar, but it is legislation now.
So what is the past benchmark for letting properties, and what are the penalties if you don't meet that requirement?
The energy rating for the rental market is still an E39 at the moment, but the only difference is that now applies to all tenancies, new or existing, within relevant properties. The government is looking to improve that. As of this conversation, I believe their target is to get to a level D by 2025 and then C by 2030. I don't think that's legislation at the moment. I think that's just a target that they've set, but that's where they're heading, which is great, you know, because a lot of our properties need bringing up to scratch. Penalties. At the moment, local councils currently police MEES regulations. They have the authority to apply fines ranging between £1,000 and £4,000, I believe. It depends on the type of breach, and I am pretty sure that £5,000 per property is the most you can be fined. So if you had done several things wrong within an EPC investigation, you could only be fined up to £5,000, but that is per property. It's worth noting as well that they can backdate a fine 18 months from the original breach date. So it's definitely worth getting things fixed as soon as possible if you know there's a problem. Like I said, it's local councils that investigate it. If it's reported to them, there's no one fixed rule for everybody. It would be an individual case. If you're under investigation, you're required to provide documentation and evidence in your defence, and they would evaluate that and then impose fines if they feel that you have breached their conditions, which may be failing to obtain an EPC, providing a false EPC, or providing false information to obtain an EPC. So these are the sort of things that people could be prosecuted for.
James, just going off the back of that, just raising a point which we haven't actually covered in some of our questions, but if we had that scenario where, you know, the EPC wasn't valid, out of date, not served correctly, that may also impact on the ability to serve a notice to get the possession back of the property. Wouldn't that be right? Yeah,
it's, because as part, you know, one of the big things that we've obviously had to introduce into the way that we work is making sure tenants are served with an EPC at the start of a tenancy. So, you know, this is all very relevant if you're starting a new tenancy. It's the first check that we make, is to make sure the EPC is still valid and in date, so that we can serve it on the tenancy, so the landlord is able to serve a Section 21 notice if they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, this is one maybe relevant to Bournemouth and other areas with older buildings. We're talking about exemption. There were certain properties that were exempt, and obviously there is a separate exemption which comes under conservation rulings and things like that. You know, is there a distinction between those two, and are there still exemptions which are eligible?
Yes, so with exemptions, there's two possible routes. You have properties that qualify for exemption automatically. These were set by the government, so places of worship, listed buildings, properties that have got a demolishment order on them, HMOs. These are all properties that are exempt from EPCs, and as a result, they're not required. For properties that fail to get an E rating but are required, still wanting to rent, there is an exemption process. It's done through the PRS exemption register when certain criteria is met. So if accepted, I think there's 6 possible exemption criteria routes you can go down. I think 5 of them give you a 5-year exemption, after which you'll need to reapply and see if you meet whatever the energy rating is of that time. And the last one is a 6-month exemption. To give you an idea, so you have an all relevant improvement exemption. So if you've done all the relevant improvements that were suggested to you, but you're still not meeting the minimum energy rating, then that would be the route you go down. There is a high cost exemption. So if you have a property and it's going to cost thousands and thousands of pounds higher than the spend cap, then you can get 3 quotes stating, look, it's going to cost me £10,000 to do the improvements, and you would be granted an exemption because it's over the 3,500 by a long way, and you're never going to see a return on that money.
Yeah.
Wall insulation exemption is one. So if the only possible way of improving your property is to put insulation in the walls, but it's not possible because maybe it's a terrace flat above a shop and you've got further flats and shops either side. If they can't do it, it can't be done. If that's the only method, then you can't improve your EPC. As long as you've shown that you've done the other any other necessary work, you'll be granted an exemption. There is a third-party exemption. So if someone else holds control of your property, for example, a freeholder, a mortgage company, superior landlord, something like that, then you can get exemption because they may be controlling what you can and cannot do. And ultimately, the risk or the blame, if you like, moves on to them for them to prove that there's a reason why you can't do the work. That's quite an unusual one. I haven't really come across that before, but it is one of the options. And if a chartered surveyor determines that there will be a drop of 5% in the property value by undertaking the necessary work in order to get an EPC up to scratch, then you would be given a exemption based on that. They can't have the value of your property going down by more than 5%. And the 6-month one is for landlords who suddenly, if you've recently become a landlord, for example, if you've just inherited a property and it's being let and there's no EPC in place, you will get 6 months to effectively get your ducks in a row. Because you might have inherited someone else's mistake, so you wouldn't straight away get a fine. You can apply, get 6 months to go through everything, get your EPC sorted, and that's the only one that doesn't last 5 years. That is just a 6-month one.
Interesting. So there's actually quite a lot covered under exemptions. It's obviously very complicated. So they've got to a point where they've got a failed EPC. What happens next? What should they do?
So if you have a EPC that isn't reaching the minimum ratings, your EPC will actually state recommendations on what you can do to raise the energy rating. This is all listed within the certificate. Depending on what the recommendations are, will determine whether you need to get specialist help. I mean, you may be able to do things yourself, like replace light bulbs with low energy LED bulbs. You may need a specialist if they need to get a new combi boiler installed, for example, or you may have to look at funding if it's solar panels, for example. But your EPC will state what you need to do. So ultimately, it's either upgrade the energy efficiency or apply for exemption.
So finally, Craig, what would your advice be to landlords who don't know about their EPC, what their score is, or where they can even find it? What should they do now?
Well, all EPCs are stored online at epcregister.co.uk. This is public information. You can do a simple search using the left-hand menu, and you can either search for properties using the postcode, or if they know it, a previous EPC number, which is a 16-digit number. This will then display the latest, the most current EPC. So when a new EPC is done, it effectively supersedes the previous, and the old one will just disappear. Again, any recommendations, upgrades, what you need to do to improve it, their estimated cost to improve it, and the contact details of the previous surveyor, they're all stored on the EPC certificate. So all that information is available to you. You can just search for it, download it, print it, do what you need to do with it.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Craig. Thanks for your time talking to us. There's a lot of really good information for people there about EPCs. I've learned some stuff there, particularly the one about the 5% value drop on the properties to get an exemption for. That's quite an interesting one. Not that I think it would affect many landlords for us locally, but it's certainly an interesting point to raise on there.
It's worth knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot again, and yeah, well, it was great to hear from you today.
No worries. You're more than welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Craig. You take care.
Bye. Bye.